Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Maximizing Efficiency and Transitioning from VMware with Citrix and Azure. We've got about 45 minutes to set aside for this topic, so let's dive right in. So first, some introductions for our team. I'm Adam Lotz, Director of Product Marketing at Citrix. I've been around about 20 years, and it feels like I've had this VMware conversation many times over that tenure.
Thank you. My name is Armando Lopez. I'm Microsoft Technical Specialist working for Citrix for 10 years now. I'm part of the Alliance team working and promoting the value of Citrix and Microsoft working together. And in my previous roles, I was working with the consulting team.
And then Kevin Ardone, I manage our solution architecture team, covering our customers in North America and Brazil. I've been with Citrix about 12 years. And actually, prior to this role, a lot of my time was spent as an architect, leading some of our largest Citrix on Azure migrations globally.
Great. Thanks, guys. So for our agenda, this will be pretty straightforward today. We're going to talk a little bit about our Microsoft partnership, how Citrix adds value on top of Microsoft and Microsoft Azure, and then we'll look a little bit at architecture and our joint solutions there, and wrap that up with a discussion around migration planning, and give you a bit of a preview of the offers that we have to help make this more commercially viable for you, and the tools that we've got to help you make this transition. So let's talk just a bit about why we're here. So I definitely see a couple of familiar names in our attendee list. So many of you joined us for an earlier webinar where we chatted about the large number of customers we have that have both Citrix and VMware Horizon deployments. And in that last webinar, the three of us chatted a bit about what those deployments look like, how we got there, and what kind of scenarios inside IT led us to have these differing environments inside of our customer base. And really what we saw is that a lot of the multi-vendor solutions we've seen in the field came as a side effect of IT silos. And there's a number of different reasons you could have gotten there. Maybe it was different teams with different projects that got spun up across, across the years inside your environment. Maybe it was a different scenario you were trying to tackle, like persistent VDI versus apps versus desktops versus non-persistent workloads. Frankly, maybe it was just another team that was trying to take over a different area of the business and provide a different level of service in terms of what they were giving their users for access. But what this has all led to is a lot of different vendor sprawl. And I think in reality, what we end up with in especially large corporate environments is we see different vendors picking off different IT tasks and trying to solve different problems. Whereas the reality is all these solutions have matured and as our product sets have gotten larger, you end up, frankly, paying multiple vendors to tackle the same fundamental issues inside your IT. And I think especially as we talk about Citrix versus VMware and the difference the companies have had in sort of their, I don't want to say culture, but their intent as they sort of grown up inside these accounts, Citrix has always taken a very user and application focused view of the world. And I think VMware really took a data center centric view. And as we moved out of the data center into cloud, certainly Citrix has really refined our stance on hybrid multi-cloud environments and what that looks like with vendors like Microsoft and Microsoft Azure to really help our customers move out of the data center, establish the right kind of hybrid footprint for their environment, and give you guys the flexibility you need for all kinds of deployments and growth, and really maximizing the value you get out of our platform and out of your choices and how you're managing that compute. So we're going to talk a little bit today specifically around what that looks like with Microsoft and the benefits that you get from tying Microsoft and Citrix together, and all the fantastic advantages we can give you in supporting your users in a more effective way.
All right, thank you, Adam. So knowing that there are some for customers looking for options to modernize their on-prem deployments, and as Adam mentioned, some others looking to move away from VMware, I would like to spend some minutes explaining why moving those to Citrix and Azure is one of the best options. First, Microsoft and Citrix just signed last April an 8-year extension for our strategic partnership, and we're very excited about this. It is another extension of our 30+ years partnership, and represents a $1.65 billion commitment between the two companies that will allow us to innovate our solutions through an integrated product roadmap and includes AI initiatives. This strategic partnership marks a significant milestone in the collaboration between Cloud Software Group and Microsoft, highlighting their mutual commitment to drive cloud adoption, innovation, and AI, and providing comprehensive support and solutions to customers worldwide. Let's talk now about why Citrix and AVD or Windows 365 are both great ways for making cloud VDIs and cloud PCs available to users on the next slide. First, With Citrix DaaS, you can create a true hybrid cloud architecture that will allow you to continue using your on-premises investments and legacy apps, and at the same time, start taking advantage of the flexibility, scale, and performance that Azure has to offer. With Citrix DaaS and Azure, you can also simplify the entire administration and monitoring under the same console, where Azure becomes another resource location to deploy apps and desktops in the same and in the easy way you do it for your on-prem resources. The experience is not only great for the people that manage the environment, but also the end users. Your employees' experience is very important and highly enhanced with Citrix. And this is not only thanks to the HDX protocol, but also by having all their applications and desktops icons into the same window, no matter where those are located. Security is another big reason for using Citrix DaaS on Azure. It improves the security across the entire stack, at rest and in flight, with stronger adaptive authentication, zero-trust approach, and features like session recording, Citrix Enterprise Browser, security analytics, and many others. And last but not least, using Citrix on Azure helps you reducing dramatically your cloud operation costs and complexity, so you can preserve more of your budget and limited IT resources with features like advanced auto-scaling, WEM, machine creation services, I/O optimizing for storage savings, as an example, our observability tools for monitoring, etc. So let's now talk about flexibility, which is one of the main benefits Citrix brings to the table. With Citrix, you have different options to deploy your environment. We still see some customers using our on-prem version, known as CVAD, but a lot of them moving to the Citrix Cloud Management Plane, which we know as Citrix DaaS. Our flexibility also gives our customers the option to decide which kind of workloads are the best fit for their use cases. As an example, you can see here in this slide, things like Linux VDAs, Mac VDAs, which is a recent enhancement that we did in our product, AVD for Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session, as an example. Or there are other users that are just consuming or using remote PC to access physical desktops. And there are others that are using workloads to access Windows 365's cloud PCs. You also have the flexibility of choosing which kind of hosting you want to use. And this is something that Citrix has been doing for a long time, right? So you can use just on-prem deployments. And now a lot of customers are going to the hybrid cloud deployments to get the benefits of on-prem and also from clouds like Azure. Or there are some that are doing full cloud deployments. In terms of endpoints, Citrix also provides a lot of options. We see in our customers things like thin clients, Android, iOS, Linux, which is one of the main benefits that you can also get with Citrix. But in this webinar, we are going to focus only on Citrix and Microsoft technologies, and we'll be discussing on the next slide how these come together. So let's go into it. On this slide, you can see how Citrix DaaS can deploy apps and desktops on the different Microsoft virtualization technologies and on-prem, making it true hybrid cloud deployment. Citrix adds value to each of these options with the features included on DaaS. Our HDX integration, as an example that you can see there for Windows 365, allow us to connect in tune with Citrix DaaS to easily deploy and manage cloud PCs. You can control all the security features from our console. You can manage the cloud PCs from our console or from a single console, which is a huge advantage. With AVD, Citrix DaaS becomes the management plane in that scenario, and you can still deploy apps and desktops in Azure, all from a single console, and with all the benefits that we provide, like user experience, security, and again, cost savings, which is, we know, something that is very important for our customers. That being said, let's go with Kevin to go through the cloud adoption framework and some recommended steps to move your environment to Citrix on Azure.
Yeah, thanks, Armando. Now that you have a better understanding of a little bit of the why and some of the unique capabilities we bring, it's really now about the how. And especially getting off of Horizon, and a lot of it comes down to like time scale. Do I lift and shift what I'm doing? Do I have the time to do proper discovery? What brought us to deliver VDI in the first place? Like, do we take the chance to take a double click down into our user groups? What can we do to change that? What can we do to adjust it? So thinking of like common use cases, especially as you are, taking a look at your existing estate, what should I bring to Azure first? How can, data center driven infrastructure with VDI, how can you change that from a business outcome standpoint, moving to more OpEx consumption-based infrastructure? Now looking at the users who are accessing that VDI, what functions do they provide for the business? If Azure, if this would be one of your first initial use cases going to Azure, do you start with something mission critical? Again, going down the time scale, like this is going to make the biggest impact, or do you start with something that might be familiar? Do we deliver an Office desktop? We're using VDI for DR, it's just some common productivity tools, Office. Can we potentially deliver that now at lower cost, moving from single session to multi-session, Windows 11, Windows 10? So looking through your existing use cases today and thinking through your time horizon, it really turns then into, do I lift and shift? I need to just consolidate this technology, I'll optimize later, or do I look at potentially, changing the form factor of how they work, do a little bit more discovery on their application requirements, discovery on where they're located. What can I do to take advantage of some of the entitlements that I get from Azure Virtual Desktop around licensing, multi-session Windows 11, or do I take advantage of Windows 365 with HDX Plus? Say, for example, if I have some developers and I want to just maintain that persistent VDI and something that's more of a flat rate model. So starting with the use cases, that then gets into a little bit more of the planning around digital estate. You want to jump to the next slide? So thinking through, talking more in the context of reevaluating and taking a look at what you've been doing in your data center, the best way to get the most benefit out of Azure and Citrix on Azure is to really take a hard look at your existing digital estate and what can we do and in our end user compute strategy to take advantage of the benefits of Azure around flexible spend, elastic infrastructure, quick scale up, quick scale down. And a lot of that comes from understanding your end users and understanding your digital estate. Are there key use cases that should be retired? Maybe we're getting off of Horizon. It doesn't make sense to do this via VDI. Let's spin that down because now we're going to deliver it as virtualized applications using Citrix on Azure because we're going to retire this version. We're going to then rehost that app in Azure or refactor it into like more of a SaaS-based solution and use something like Citrix Enterprise Browser, secure private access to then deliver that same user experience for that set of applications in addition to the VDI or standard hosted applications. Now, one of the great things around Citrix, especially as you move from your data center to the cloud, is you can also use, you can deliver your apps and your desktops from anywhere. So if you have an application that needs to be rehosted into Azure and is a key dependency for some of your Horizon workloads, you could deliver that from Citrix on-prem, especially if you're using Citrix already. Let's virtualize that application to our new Citrix VDI on Azure as we move the critical backend data into Azure, especially if you're doing a data center consolidation. Or maybe, for instance, you're looking at changing your on-prem hypervisor as well to something like Nutanix, an area that we're going to cover in a future webinar. Can I deliver that application from my on-prem data center to my VDI in Azure, vice versa? You're really double clicking into that flexibility that Armando and Adam mentioned that really brings our platform together and across all these infrastructure providers. Then there's maintaining your existing operations. Now, one of the great things about Citrix is our ability to convert images. We have like this function called the image portability service. You can convert images from VMware to Azure within our provisioning technologies. We have a Terraform provider that allows you to scale up and build Citrix infrastructure in a configuration as code methodology. So maybe what you're doing is you're collapsing some of your larger data centers that are regional and maybe moving to more of a global model. Let's take one data center and let's extrapolate that across a few different regions to better serve our customer base. You can do that in an automated way with our Terraform provider to then scale up and use a configuration as code approach. Then there really gets into that optimization. So we've looked through our digital estate. We understand, how do our operations change going to Azure? We know what our applications are. What can we do to now optimize that? If you were doing persistent VDI before, having a good discovery on your application distribution via like SCCM or Intune to those apps, to those VDI, do we try to make a gold image and run it in a non-persistent way so we can take the most advantage out of multi-session Windows 10, multi-session Windows 11, and that so we can deliver this at the best optimal cost. And this is where Citrix can also help, especially looking at our recent acquisition of Uber Agent and like working with your team. Hey, can we get this deployed on some of our VDI? do discovery in terms of what applications and performance needs are, and then use that data to refactor that and go to Azure. That's something where if you're account technology strategist on the Citrix side, conversation you should definitely have with them in terms of how we can help. So again, planning, and where we really see the most success when moving from Horizon Azure is when you have the opportunity, especially because of the data center change, to take a look at how you've been delivering and really optimize that towards the best of what you can really pull out of Azure in terms of capability, especially when it comes to moving from a single session to multi-session, persistent to non-persistent, et cetera. But yeah, do you want to jump to the next slide, Orlando?
Yeah, actually, Kevin, I had a question for you. So we chatted about this a little bit in the previous webinar, right? And you talked about the timeline to make this plan realistic. What do you think that looks like for most enterprises, right? And how far do they have to go to be successful here? I mean, do you move everything at once? You said, start incrementally. What's the timeline there for that test period? And, when do you know you've got success that you can replicate?
Yeah, so like incrementally, incrementally, if you have like a time horizon, like you're looking at, okay, this renewals for, like 18 months, 2 years out, like let's move in shifts. Now, if you're trying to, obviously, again, vendor consolidation, a lot of that's really driven around commercial constructs. You tend to have to move everything over. So in the context of like an end-to-end IT change, which often when it comes to cloud infrastructure, your VDI may be one of the first workloads that go to Azure, but you're also looking at it comprehensively. How does our networking change? How does our governance change? How do our operations change? So oftentimes, like incrementally, VDI might be the first use case that goes, and then you're looking at refactoring or like getting SAP up there, getting other mission critical applications like your EMR into Azure, and like those are maybe phase 2 and phase 3. But at least in the context of vendor consolidation of Horizon from Citrix on Azure, you're going to have to get it all across the finish line, especially to get the best, the commercial benefits of vendor consolidation. And that's often, again, we've seen some scenarios where you just do a lift and shift over the course of a couple months and then optimize later versus, planning out this across with your vendor management team, looking at your contracts. Hey, you know what, it makes sense to move to one core VDI provider. And we're also looking at changing some of our data center operations, again, to also consolidate our hypervisor into Azure. Let's start this project now, and let's do it in a way that's going to allow us to do it incrementally and optimize so we take the most advantage of Azure. So to answer your question, Adam, it depends. But what's great is between like the Citrix and Microsoft team, and we'll cover this a little bit later in the webinar, like we have a lot of programs that can be leveraged across our partner community. So that way you don't have to go through this on your own.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, right, that as you change that back-end data center model, your users aren't necessarily impacted by that, right? Once you talk about how users are accessing their applications using Workspace app with Citrix, like users sort of get conditioned for this is how I access my work, this is where my applications live.
Exactly.
You can make all those back-end data center and cloud changes without impacting them in a negative way.
Exactly, and that's one of the great things too around how like our architecture is, where you have like the workloads as well as like the control infrastructure completely being separated. It gives administrators a lot of flexibility where, okay, this desktop or this application, it's existing in my data center or existing in Azure. Users are none the wiser when you make that change. And especially if you're listening and you have Citrix already, your help desk, you're deploying Workspace app, maybe you're already deploying Workspace app on a clinician desktop that's Horizon, and then your EMR is being delivered via Citrix. There is some built-in operations already if you're in a mixed environment where you're not talking about too much of a change when it comes to, okay, now we got to have the users for VDI that we're using Workspace app. We got to get that scaled out. We got to update our help desk. Hey, you now need to go through this Citrix call script when it's a VDI user. So a lot of our customers that are mixed environment, they already know how to maintain Workspace app. We already know how to maintain a Citrix image. It's really now all about bringing it into one core infrastructure, and then you get to the data center moves around application data, user data, and like what needs to change architecturally there.
Yep, that makes sense.
And that kind of goes back again, a great question, Adam, as well, leading into this slide, and thinking of, again, that flexibility. Now, if you do take the time to look at optimizing, hey, we're persistent VDI on-prem. We had this, M&A, and rather than shipping out laptops, we wanted to just spin up a bunch of VDI on Horizon for one of our user communities, and we've had that maintained for a while. We're ready to consolidate vendors, and we're going to Azure. Let's optimize it. So that's why going through that digital estate plan, like really understanding those Horizon use cases, what apps are they using, how often they use, if they are persistent, could we move to a non-persistent golden image model, especially when you start thinking of Azure around the concept of shared compute. If I can spin up a machine, that machine could be used by me during my shift, Adam during your shift, Armando during your shift. You really take advantage of that pay-as-you-go model, or again, reservations, depending on how much capacity you have, to really drive down the overall cost. And then when you start getting into multi-session on top of that, you can take what was once a high-cost single-session persistent VM and bring it into a multi-session non-persistent and really change the cost dynamic for the better. So looking and understanding those use cases, again, working with your Citrix account technology strategists and some of the our overall partners, we can also, assess the existing Horizon estate. What does it make sense to refactor the use case into something that's more optimal? Let's take a look at, if you are managing those machines via Intune or SCCM, let's take a look at the application distribution data. Hey, these 30 applications are being used across 80% of the estate. Maybe we start there as the first persona and create like a general purpose desktop that can be used across a larger user base.
Yeah, and Kevin, I think in the global IT outages we saw just a couple of weeks ago, I think we have a whole new appreciation for non-persistent images and the value of centralization there, right? There's a lot of benefits that come with the way you deploy these applications and desktops. Even though we see, of course, users tend to say, I want a persistent desktop, I want to maintain my image, I want control over that. I think from the IT perspective, there's many ways to give users what they need.
Yeah, it's definitely a dynamic, and it does really get into that centralization versus decentralization conversation around, okay, by decentralizing this workload, I also potentially decentralize my risk. If I suddenly if I push out an update and I have 5% issue across, say, like 1,000 machines, I'm having to go and fix like a large amount of machines, and that can then increase my burden on IT. It can extend the impact to end users. Centralizing, and especially non-persistent, you can roll back to a prior version. But it does take like operational maturity and rigor, working across the teams, working across app owners with a very tight update timeline. Again, looking at your IT organization, hey, persistent, this has made sense. Like, this is easy for us. We just need to consolidate vendors. Like when you look at like what we can do with hibernation on Azure, you look at also like reservations, you look at also Cloud PC with Windows 365. There are a lot of great technologies that we have between Citrix and Microsoft that if you need to just lift and shift, like I don't have the time for that. Windows 10 end of life is coming up in, end of support in 2025. That's what our Horizon's on. Let's just kind of go to Windows 11 within Azure. Users are going to have to rebuild and reinstall applications anyway. Let's give them a clean slate and then go from there. So there is some compelling, also like Windows OS life cycle dates, like looking at the next year, which it might make sense to do a refactor when it comes to user persona. Or if you're not, okay, let's redeploy on a new hypervisor if we're changing operating systems anyway. And that again gets into like, how do you do it cost effectively? So if you do have the time, one of the things we really lead with on the Citrix architecture side is if you have the time horizon, like let's not just lift and shift, like really think about, okay, how are those workloads being consumed? What's the resource profile of them? What are their uptimes and how often are they being used? Do you create a tiered service model? Maybe originally when you were doing your data center sizing, because it's a little bit easier to keep VDI size consistent, you made everything the same size, one size fits all. Hey, let's lift and shift that to Azure. Well, now that you have at your fingertips, like multi-session Windows 11, especially when it comes to simplifying your application packaging, security tooling, as well as like just varied VM family sizes within Azure with their varied cost profiles, having more of a tiered service model, especially when it comes to optimizing costs, can also be very efficient. And then looking at obviously your Horizon estate and like moving that to Citrix, there's this whole concept of timeouts, like I'm not using my machine, it goes idle, it disconnects. If you want to, like looking at how people are using their VDI, especially on-prem, you might have the aptitude to like leave that thing up and running forever. It's just data center power. But now when you get into Azure, like just having a machine that's not being used, like that creates cost inefficiencies. So how do you also adjust your timeouts to facilitate better shutdowns and draining? So even if you're doing a lift and shift, because you don't have the time horizon to do a little bit of a re-architecture. Looking at your session timeouts could be also a way to kind of get folks off those machines a little bit earlier. So that way you don't have a VM that's up and running. Now looking at obviously like a cloud PC with HDX Plus on the Citrix side, you get to more of like a flat rate where, okay, let's leave this up and running. So like use cases that have long daily uptimes, like developers, you're compiling code, that could be a benefit. But again, going back to what Armando said, you can run all of that within one infrastructure, especially when you want to take advantage of the flexibility of Citrix with AVD, or like the simplicity of Citrix HDX Plus with Cloud PC and Windows 365. You can do both. So like understanding your use cases, who fits into what bucket, users are none the wiser when they go to that access portal. You know, they don't know what desktop, where their desktop's coming from. All that matters to them is that they're able to do the most work. And that's again where the tooling comes into play. So those are some of the tactics and then getting to profile sizing and things along those lines as well. But you also have tools at your fingertips too, like auto scale when it comes to automatically controlling those efficiencies of those AVD workloads delivered via Citrix. You also have tooling known like Workspace Environment Manager from a profile policy, but also a resource optimization side, something that you can run to maybe have your cloud PC be a lower resource SKU, so you can save costs there, or running those within a multi-session machine to get more users per machine. Looking at also like storage can be a big piece of like overall cost on Azure. So with Citrix, you also have the ability with Citrix provisioning and things like ephemeral disk support, on-demand provisioning to also control your storage usage. So that way you're delivering those machines, storage is blown away, rebuilt to control that, or you're using ephemeral disk, so you're not even charged for the storage, again, to reduce your overall total cost of ownership. And then lastly, when it comes to help desk tooling, we've done a lot in terms of Citrix observability as well as Director to really give you what you need above and beyond some of the core tools that are on the AVD or Cloud PC side to ensure that you maintain that operation going from on-prem, we're using Citrix for apps, to within Azure, we're now using Citrix for VDI, Citrix for applications, because we've consolidated off the Horizon. All the tooling that you're using for Citrix today would still be applicable or would have enhancements, especially if you move towards Citrix Cloud in that pursuit of moving towards Azure, which is a common architectural change as well that customers go through.
Yeah, and Kevin, I think we have a lot of people, especially when you talk about moving from on-prem to cloud, they have major concerns about cost, right? I mean, we talk about hybrid cloud, we talk about even cloud repatriation projects where people move some workloads to cloud, move them back on-prem. They're not sure what their spending is going to look like. And I know that VDI has always been a big concern area there. And I think, from an engineering perspective, we've gone hard after that problem over the last 18 months. I mean, we've made tremendous improvements in auto scale and in our visibility to what you're spending in cloud resources. I think it's really fundamental to our platform strategy that we want to help people make the best use of all these different platforms and drive down their spending where we can to optimize, the users they can put in these cloud workloads.
Exactly. Yeah, like especially like maybe when you built VDI in your data center, the cost profile, it didn't make sense to replace some laptops for certain users. But like then looking at the benefits and flexibility of like spending on Azure, hey, we had interns. It made more sense to, rather than buying hardware you have to depreciate over years, let's just give some of our interns or like these contractors laptops because it's easier. But now when you start thinking of, I can have a machine, it exists for just like 3 months because I've spun up this project temporarily, maybe it does make sense to now do that on Azure. So I don't have to deal with supply chain and shipping out workloads that need to be re-imaged after they get shipped back to me for these temporary users. So it does really change a lot of like the cost dynamics, especially on VDI projects. So when you originally went to Horizon and now moving towards Citrix, there may be use cases that, hey, we're re-architecting, we're optimizing like this other use case that's full laptops. Like, why don't we also virtualize that as well and bring that into the overall fold when it comes to like reshaping our EC strategy?
And there is a recent engagement that came with on top of auto-scaling, that is hibernation, which also help a lot to improve the experience for the users. Like now they can start their work where they left it, no matter if they were controlling the power of the computer. So that was another good thing that came recently, and that we also have an integration in our console for that to be used.
No, definitely, and especially if now obviously like in some scenarios for some of those listening to this, you may be have Azure already up and ready, it's ready to take workloads. Others, you may just be getting started. There are a lot of mutual resources between Citrix and Microsoft, especially on the Microsoft Learn, around enterprise scale support for Citrix on Azure that walks through key reference architectures, like what does it look to have like enterprise scale Azure aligned with their overall cloud adoption framework and methodology. Definitely recommend checking out that reference, especially if you know, hey, we want to move and you know, towards Azure. Maybe we don't have any Azure yet. It gives a lot of great foundational information as well as key design decisions you need to think about, especially if Citrix and VDI is going to be one of your first workloads going there. So we've talked a little bit about now like methodology and like thought process and design thinking, and you know, how do we get there? What are the things we need to think about, especially when it comes to conceptually moving your data center to Azure? You know, big conversation, but the biggest thing is, you know, you're not on your own when it comes to this. You know, Citrix, we've invested a lot in promotions to help you get there from a licensing standpoint, as well as promotions with Microsoft to help fund the overall migration, as well as help you stand up Azure or Citrix Cloud, especially if those are prerequisites to doing this successfully. Adam, would you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, Kevin, and absolutely. We want to help you get there, right? So both on the Citrix and the Microsoft side, we want to make this easier for customers to standardize on our platform, especially if you've got VMware workloads that you want to sort of jettison out of the data center. There's real opportunity there to save money on your Citrix renewals in terms of increasing the number of users you have. We've got some great options to either credit you back a year towards your spend, or in some cases even give you unlimited users for this upcoming period so that you can make that migration to Citrix. And like you said earlier, right, this is not an overnight effort. We know this takes, you know, months to potentially years, depending on your account. So we're there with you to help you plan that out, to look at the commercial constructs around when you might need to renew one software package, where you're at in a deployment, and really looking at ways to help you get there through our partner ecosystem, as well as our friends at Microsoft, who are certainly, you know, they're also motivated to help you take advantage of Azure and really leverage that platform as best you can. So plenty of options for you. We'll give you guys a link back to the offers page so you can see exactly what you've got there, and definitely something to talk over with your partner or your Citrix account rep in terms of more details about what that looks like in terms of a realistic action plan to help you make the transition. So we've got about 5-10 minutes left. We can do some quick Q&A. I've seen some good questions come in from the audience across the last half hour. First, let's take Jamie. Jamie says, can I buy Citrix capacity through the Azure Marketplace? Can I use my Mac agreement funds for this? Armando, do you want to take that?
Yeah, of course. You can do it. And that's one of the great benefits. So at the end, you can decrement your Mac agreement with the licenses that you will be purchasing with Citrix, and that will help you to unlock future discounts also in that agreement. So yeah, you can do that, and it is a very good idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of customers doing that lately. That seems like a good way to have that conversation with your sales rep to figure out how to effectively use the funds you've already committed, right? So that saves a lot of IT budgeting hassle on your side. Okay, Rang and a couple others were asking specifically about tools to help migrate environments from Horizon to Citrix. So specifically on the virtualization, the app and desktop virtualization side. Kevin, what do you think about that?
So at least like with the images, especially when it comes to like moving that image off of VMware, you know, first it all, you know, starts with like getting those images within the Citrix system. So like throwing on our VDA, our virtual delivery agent, which allows us to start like managing that base image and registering that machine within our control plane. So if you're in like a non-persistent factor, like, hey, let's throw in, you know, use your existing golden image, let's put that VDA on that machine, convert it into a Citrix Machine Creation Services image, then use the image portability service to move that into Azure. We also have like capabilities, especially if you are, you know, leveraging Citrix today and you maybe don't have Citrix Cloud and you're not using Citrix Cloud. Other than the migration funding Adam mentioned, you know, hey, let's work with a partner, like our team will also support from like a guidance perspective, and let's get, you know, Citrix will help and Microsoft will help fund that stand-up of Citrix Cloud, and then using the Azure modernize and migrate. Maybe you don't have an Azure landing zone yet. What does that look like? There's a funding avenue there. Okay, we need to do these things. Like then you have the automated configuration tool. We can move your settings from your existing cloud Citrix environment into Citrix Cloud. Again, like some of the automation I mentioned, like, hey, you know what, we want to move the configuration as code. let's do this a little bit of a different way. And then that way we can scale up across multiple Azure environments. So there is tooling available, but always in these projects, there's like tooling and what can be done in an automated way. But migrations are often very complex, especially at scale with like end-to-end testing, reviewing policies. Do we like maintain these policies? How do they change from a protocol standpoint? That's really where the migration funding comes into play, and working with one of your trusted partners as well as your Citrix team. We can help you leverage that entitlement, especially if you're willing to migrate to our solution and use it effectively to help fund that migration.
Yeah, Kevin, you said automation a couple times in there. So Ashish had a question as well. He said, what automation tools are out there? What does that look like for Citrix management?
So we have, obviously within Citrix, like cloud, we have our API, like on-prem, we have our PowerShell SDK, something that a lot of customers have used historically to drive automation. So there is that Terraform provider, so being able to automate deployment via Terraform. We also have, from a user experience and just overall operations side, there's the Citrix ITSM adapter. So this plugs into ServiceNow, say from like a workload provisioning, approval flow, giving access can all be done through ServiceNow for a lot of core admin functions. This could also be customized accordingly. So it really kind of depends on like what you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to accomplish just basic care and feeding tasks? Like you can use scripted actions within WEM to run scripts based off of events that occur within the VDA, to like automating provisioning, or just automating workload management with things like autoscale, either driving the power states, getting people in and out of hibernation, up and down and drained out of machines accordingly with dynamic timeout settings, or doing dynamic provisioning. Say our demand for this use case has spiked unexpectedly. We don't have enough machines. Perfect. Like let's create those machine accounts, spin up those machines on Azure. We can provision dynamically. So there's automation tools available really kind of through varied aspects of the user as well as the admin lifecycle. Kind of really just depends on what you're trying to do. And that's again where working with your Citrix account technology strategist or like one of the your trusted partner as well, like we can help you walk through and how to best use these new capabilities.
Yeah, and Armando, I think your slide earlier sparked a number of questions. I've got Christina says, how does Citrix work with Windows 365 and how is it licensed versus AV VMs? I think she means Azure Virtual Desktop, AVD VMs. So what's that look like? I guess, when we talk about 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop, what are the key differences people should think about there in terms of what that means for a Citrix deployment?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. That's a very good question. So at the end, Windows 365 and AVD are for different use cases, right? So you have the persistent desktop that normally fits the Windows 365 use case for people that want to have that persistent desktop and it is available, easy to use and consume. So we have a solution that adds value to that. You can manage those desktops, deploy those desktops using Citrix, and we also provide all this value that we already mentioned around the user experience, around the security that we can provide, session recording, etc. So that's one use case. The other one on AVD provides you more flexibility. There are some use cases that requires, more flexibility in terms of what they can do or not do. The non-persistent desktops is obviously one that fits into AVD. So it is really on what Kevin mentioned and take us through the different use cases and which are the requirements that they have when you are going to start taking those decisions. But at the end, those are two technologies provided by Microsoft where we can connect and we can deploy desktops and applications in the same way and add the same value to them.
Yeah, and Kevin, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. I mean, would you say that, is Windows 365 sort of the rebirth of the dedicated persistent VDI image?
I think it adds a lot of, especially if you're standardizing on Intune for your management, you've gotten off SCCM. It's a completely new way to deploy and manage a desktop. In thinking like a persistent VDI in Windows 365 versus Azure Virtual Desktop, like Armando mentioned, it really kind of depends on your degree of control that you need. Like you could do a lot more customization in terms of how your infrastructure is set up within Azure Virtual Desktop. So depending on like what your security considerations are, things along those lines. There's also like the uptime that's expected on a per machine basis. Like, is that better than like the flat rate, which I would have to purchase in like an annual sense for that end user, like when it comes to like that cloud PC SKU license. So oftentimes like one of the best things you can do is like just get started, and as you've kind of gotten users working and leveraging something like, Citrix on AVD. Okay, now we look at this data, like how do we tweak did we over provision our storage, or is our SKU too big? Based on the uptime of this use case, it probably makes sense to use Cloud PC and take advantage of that flat rate, because we're leveraging, we've moved our identity to hybrid join. One of the things with Cloud PC you got to remember as well is like some of the identity considerations. Like you can't really do just Azure AD only join machines. So if you're not ready for hybrid join or Entra ID, if you're not ready for Entra ID only join VMs because of your application estate and like you haven't sorted out your authentication, you might need to start with using Azure Virtual Desktop and using standard AD domain services to start. So there are a few factors there as well architecturally that need to be considered. But it is, again, like another tool in the tool belt that can be used really, again, based on the use case, which is always like the starting point for these projects. What are the key business drivers that are driving this change? And, thinking of the use cases that are consuming this service, what's their criticality, what's their resource profile, what assets are they using and applications are they using? Now let's design accordingly and adjust accordingly, and then prioritize based on the impact that it's going to make to the business.
Yeah, and I think realistically, right, the vast majority of our accounts have both, right? They have a footprint that's going to be AVD for some workloads and some user types, some personas, some 365, and frankly, some still on-prem. Like we see that across the board. Yep.
Yeah. And I think your question, Adam, or the question that came, we're also talking about licensing, and I don't think that I respond that piece, but in terms of Citrix, the license that our customer have will cover both. So you don't have to buy any extra licensing or add-on. That's already included in the new SKUs that we have for our customers.
Right. Yeah. So that flexibility is easy to experiment with, easy to try out different platforms. And yeah, definitely the right way to tackle different kinds of problems with these different offerings we got on the Microsoft side. So gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion, and everyone in the audience, thank you for joining as well. Just some next steps for you. We've got one more webinar in this three-part series. So the next time we're going to talk a little bit more about Citrix and Nutanix. Of course, Nutanix also has a great hybrid cloud story out there with Azure. Nutanix is a great partner of both Microsoft and Citrix. And they've got an interesting perspective on the industry and everything they can do in terms of high performance on-prem environments as well. Please feel free to reach out to your partner, your account team, have the conversation a little bit early. Say, hey, I'm thinking about making that migration. I've got both Citrix and VMware. What would it take to push that into one place to simplify my environment and really take advantage of the offerings we have out there now? And you can learn about those at citrix.com. We've got a QR code you can click on to get more details. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining, and we will see you on the next call.
Thank you.